Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the Vulcan Utilizing Digital Protocol project. This webinar is jointly sponsored by Vulcan HL7 Accelerator, Transcelerate, and CDISC, and today we're going to take you through a spotlight on our recent Connectathon results and future plans. Next slide, please. Our agenda for today. First, we'll do a bit of introductions and some logistics for today. And then we want to give a brief overview of the UDP project. I would highlight that this is a multiple series webinar. We have had one before. There's a recording available if you would like a deeper dive on the history of the project. But after today's brief overview, we'll spend most of the time talking through the Connectathon. For those of you who haven't attended one, we want to put you in the room, give you a sense of what that experience is like, what happens at a Connectathon. We'll walk through the business process that was being tested. We'll go through the technical tests performed, and we'll talk to you about the results and why they are so exciting and why we're all so excited to be part of this project. And then we'll look ahead to what's coming in the next Connectathon, which will be held in January. Then we'll turn it over to think about what does this all mean from an implementation perspective, and how do you take steps towards implementation. And we will have plenty of time for Q&A. And I want to highlight that there is many opportunities to ask questions, and if they don't get answered today, you can still send them in after. We'll try to address them in materials. So with that, I'll go to the next slide and I'll go through a few logistics for the session. Everyone's going to be on mute. The audio, hopefully you can listen in here. If you have questions, there is a little question mark symbol at the top right. You should click that and you can enter your questions at any time. It's helpful if you have a specific speaker that you want to answer to go ahead and put their name in there. But we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. Feel free to enter them throughout the session, and we'll do that in the moderated panel. There is also a handout. You'll see another button at the top right, and if you click that, it's a little bit of a takeaway. Also a takeaway is this session is being recorded, so as a registered attendee, you will get a link to the recording after the session. All right, next slide. Just a few ground rules for today. We want to make this as interactive as possible, but there are a few things we can't discuss. We will stay generally germane to what the project is and what we're talking about. And with that, we'll be mindful that any use of the outcomes of any of these projects or any of the folks presenting today is really up to the user. We don't guarantee compliance, that sort of thing. We won't address questions around vendor preferences, vendor costs, anything about product development plans. That's not in the public domain. Just good basic conversation. We want to keep focused on the project and all the things that we are enabling through this project. All right, next slide, please. With that, I'm going to ask my speakers to turn on their cameras, and we're going to do some introductions. Again, this is a webinar series that we are co-sponsoring, so we have our representatives from Vulcan, Transcelerate, and CDISC, and last time we had speakers from FDA and EMA, so again, if you want to hear what they have to say, you can go listen to that recording. And today we have Dave Iberson-Hurst, who was quite active in our Connectathon, to tell us more about that. So we'll go around, and Hugh, if you want to give a quick introduction.
Yeah, hello, I'm Hugh Glover. I'm the Technical Director for Vulcan. I've been with Vulcan since it was established some 4 years ago. Prior to that, I've worked with a CRO. I've also worked as an independent consultant, and I've been involved with HL7 and fire really for about 20 years now. So I get accused of being an HL7 veteran. But looking forward to talking today about the progress we're making with this project.
Great, thank you, Hugh. Vivian?
Hi, I'm Vivian Combs. I'm and executive director at Lilly's Clinical Trial Foundations organization. I've been in the pharma industry for 29 years. I came up through medical writing, so that's communications is my core expertise. And within Lilly, my day job is to be responsible and own all of our medical writing and communication related processes in clinical development. And then I also formerly led the Transcelerate Common Protocol Template work stream. And currently I'm leading the pharma delegation for ICH M11. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Vivian. A lot of relevant hats that you're wearing. Thank you for joining us. Chris?
Thanks, Stacy. I'm Chris Decker, the head of CDISC, and I've been in this role for a little over 9 months. Prior to that, I've spent my entire career within clinical research. I like to call myself a recovering statistician. I spent about my first 10 years within pharmaceutical companies doing clinical research, transformational change, and really how do we leverage technology and standards. And I've spent the last 20 years in technology and consulting companies doing the same. I will share that this area of digital protocol, when I joined CDISC at the beginning of the year, was a newer area for me. So I'm probably the new kid on the block in this group, at least, that's on the call. But I also think it's the most exciting. For the decades we've been trying to change and transform standards and how we leverage them, I think this area of digital protocol, starting at the beginning, where we should have, hindsight's 2020, should have started 25, 30 years ago. We are here now, and we have an opportunity to really drive change by starting at this point in the process. So I'm excited about it, throwing myself into it, and looking forward to sharing today how these three organizations, as well as industry, are really collaborating together, which is also just as exciting. Thank you, Stacy.
Couldn't agree more with the excitement. All right, Dave, last and not least, our guest star, Dave.
Dave Iberson-Hurst. I'm the CDISC USDM Unified Study Definitions Model product owner, which we developed in collaboration with Transcelerate. 25 years in the pharma industry. There's a few more other years elsewhere, but 25 years in the pharma industry. And I've been involved with CDISC pretty much the whole of those 25 years because I needed a standard when I first entered the pharma industry, and I found one within CDISC. I've worked within sponsors as on the vendor side and also as a consultant. But the last 18 months really working with M11, bringing it together with USDM and with the firework, which is what we're going to discuss today. So sort of deep in the weeds on the technical side, bringing these things together, and we'll explain how later on. Thanks, Stacey.
Yeah, thank you all. It's really great to work with all of you. I'm glad you're able to speak today. Now we'll turn it over to Hugh and to Chris to give us some foundational information around the UDP project.
Thank you, Stacey. I'll start off, and then I'll hand it off to Hugh in a little bit as we go through. So I get to do the introduction. So for those that have been to a couple of webinars already, maybe you can go get a cup of coffee or look at an email or two. I'm kidding, but we always want to make sure we give this foundational introduction. So we know we always have new people that are joining us that want to learn about what we're doing, as well as sometimes you need to hear a message a few times. But really what we're talking about when we talk about digitizing the protocol is shifting from where we've been since the beginning of time, really, with protocols in terms of digital, of having the information in these PDF files. And then as we look at these PDF files, how do we move from that information that's currently stored there into a data-first paradigm, into a digital paradigm? So I'll share a couple statistics with you that have been shared with me. One of them is that about 50% of the content in a protocol is incorrectly transcribed somewhere downstream within a system or within a process. Another statistic I just heard last week was that about, I think it was around 20 times information is transcribed So a piece of data from the protocol is transcribed about 20 times in systems elsewhere. So if you think about that, if you really take a step back and think about those statistics, they're kind of disturbing a little bit, that what we rely on in a protocol and that information that needs to be used, that's critical to running the trial, has so many areas where a mistake can happen, where you can have errors in the process. So the idea is that we move to an area where we start to digitize this information as much as we can. You can't digitize all of science, but you can create a lot of digital information, structured information, and create a standard model, which Dave will be talking about a lot more later, and then use that information over and over again. So it's really about that idea of writing once and then be able to use many times downstream as we go forward. So that's the important piece of this. Next slide. So I want to introduce a concept. You might have heard M11. I was at an event last week with CDISC and Transcelerate, looking at our model and how to leverage a digital protocol. And I asked this question about how many people knew about M11. And it was more than 6 months ago when I asked it, but still about half the audience didn't. So M11 is an ICH initiative to really define a clinical and electronic structured and harmonized protocol. So it's really about globally bringing all the organizations, the regulatory organizations together and defining this standard, this guideline, this structure. And so the idea here is that they produce the M11 template and the technical specifications, and we can leverage that then in what we've been doing over the last few years to build a digital protocol. And what the nice thing about this is with the Vulcan initiative, in terms of utilizing the digital protocol, is we're able to bring it together under one umbrella. So there's a lot more we could share about M11. As Stacy pointed out, go look at the previous webinar that we did. A number of regulatory folks spoke on that, and they can talk more about that. So if you want to learn more, I'd suggest go and look at the previous webinar, but it's key to what we're trying to achieve. Next slide. So let me talk a little bit about the CDISC USDM model. So as Dave mentioned, this is a collaboration over the last 3 years between Transcelerate and CDISC to develop a model that's robust, and we can deliver the information from a digital protocol. So we've gone through 3 iterations of that. We just released version 3 at the beginning of the year, which is a much more robust version of the model that we can really start to leverage. There's still areas we need to continue to enhance and improve the model. But when we talk about a model, in past lives, when we talked about CDISC standards, it was the PDF files and the spreadsheets. We need to move to a world where we have models that have a logical model and terminology and API specifications. Those are all included within the USDM model. Again, the Unified Study Definition model. And that allows us to be able to leverage this model in a way that systems can leverage it, and we can pass information back and forth within the model. And again, that model includes the model itself, the terminology. It's very important that we have the controlled terminology. And one of the things that we're working very hard to do is harmonize with the M11 work that ICH is doing. So our version 3 harmonizes with the M11 in its current state. M11 is not final yet. It won't be for another year and a half. But when we get to the point where it is, we're going to continue to harmonize with that information and make sure that the M11 information is contained within the model. We also have the implementation guides that go with it and the examples so that you understand how to use the model as we go forward. So again, our goal going forward, at least at CDISC, is to make sure all the models we develop are complete and have all the components that are needed to really implement them. Next slide. So as we think about this collaboration, the reason that we're on the call today and the Vulcan initiative around utilizing digital protocol is to bring these organizations together and use the strengths of each to really produce a robust implementation and collaboration. So we have ICH, and ICH M11 has the tech specs and the template, the guideline as well. Within CDISC and Transcelerate, we built out the USDM model. Again, our target, as we thought about it, is is how are sponsors, how are pharmaceutical companies and biotechs and the industry going to use this information? So their need is different than regulatory's needs. So 3 years ago, we started down that path of building out that model. So the USDM model is a much more in-depth, detailed, granular model, and the M11 is a component of that. So within this model, again, we have the model itself, the terminology, which includes both the M11 and the standard USDM terminology, the API, and then also we're in the process of making sure we have conformance that goes along with that model. So with every model that we produce, we need to have conformance, executable rules that check the information that gets carried. And then surrounding all that is our ability to be supported by the Vulcan initiatives. So with that, I'm actually going to hand it off to Hugh to let him explain sort of how it gets all wrapped under the same umbrella.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So you may not know exactly what Vulcan is. As I said earlier, I've been with Vulcan since it was established about 4 years ago. So we're a relatively new initiative. We came out of HL7 with the one objective being to help the clinical research community as a whole make better use of fire as a means of transferring data from one place to another. And in constructing that, we were trying to deal with some of the gaps that we could observe in what people were doing. There were gaps in people's understanding, so a clear need for some education. There were gaps in what people knew about that was going on, so we could see projects that were going on in multiple places being run by different people, and yet actually they were very, very similar projects. So if we could bring those together, we made better use of everybody's resources. And that's a third gap, which is how do we make better use of everybody's resources? We can bring a certain amount of resource to resolving problems really in a very tactical way to help whichever projects are running at the moment that could benefit from specific fire expertise, or maybe some project management expertise, or bringing in some sort of specialist expertise to help with things. So as part of that process, about 18 months ago, ICH came to Vulcan and said, well, we can see that in the long term, we're going to need a fire implementation guide for what we're doing in M11. Can you help us do that, please? And we, of course, said, yes, we're very happy to help with dealing with that, and looked at what their proposal was. And their proposal was really around a single use case, and that single use case was the sponsor to regulator use case. We already had a project running which is looking at expressing the schedule of activities in fire format. And it became immediately obvious that if we extended the number of use cases we were looking at, we could meet the ICH use case. We could also bring the digital protocol to bear on a whole series of other problems that you might find within running a trial and developing a protocol. And we wanted to see how many different things we could do along that way. Another part of that was realizing that we could work with CDISC and Transcelerate on the USDM. And Vulcan really now is acting as an umbrella to these different organizations, trying to pull together all of these different components in a way that gives everybody the most efficient way of dealing with things, and also gets for all the long-term users the most efficient and the most effective way of making use of a digital protocol. One of the confusions that I think some people have, and if you've heard me talk this one through before, apologies, but as Chris said, we know we've got people who are listening to this for the first time. So are we really dealing here with three different solutions to the same problem? And if we've got 3 different solutions to the same problem, have we actually got conflict between them? And I think I can see Chris shaking his head, because absolutely we do not have 3 different solutions to the same problem. What we have is different levels of solution to the same problem. So what ICH are doing is bringing something which gives structure to the way you describe the contents of a protocol, so that we can go to section, and I make the section numbers up, we go to section 3.4.1 and we find that that always deals with inclusion criteria. Whereas if you go and look at a protocol at the moment, you'll find inclusion criteria might be in partly in one section, partly in another section. If we have that consistency in the way the sections are put together, it makes it much easier to take the whole process forwards. What the CDISC Transcelerate development is doing with USDM is saying, well, what are the actual data items that you need to work with? So this provides a more detailed view of the individual bits of data that you need to carry if you're going to deal with inclusion criteria, for instance. So wherever they might be found, however they might be used, it's the same set of bits of data that you are going to use. When we get down to Vulcan's level and fire, what we are talking about is how we transmit this information from one place to another. How do we do that electronically? And what fire has provided is a consistent means of sending standard clinical data from one system to another in a way that systems can use that data without losing content, and making use of very standardized tools. And maybe an example of that to help illustrate it is if you think of the transition of the shipping industry over the last 70 or 80 years. There was a point at which all shipping cargo was individually bundled up, and it took a whole series of people with cranes and nets to pack it onto a ship and take it somewhere. And every single bit of cargo that was being taken was a new problem, a new packing problem, a new way of putting things in. Then somebody invented the idea of a shipping container, and suddenly we've got a standard package. You put your cargo into that standard package, and then handling that standard package becomes a very straightforward thing from that point onward. Fire is effectively a shipping container. There are standard tools out there for dealing with that data, for moving it around. It makes it an easy thing to deal with. So Vulcan, in what we are doing at the moment, is coordinating across these different pieces of work. You can see there's a lot of elements on this. Each of the little boxes on here is another element, another development process. And if we go to the next slide, please. You'll see on this slide the timeline for development for each of these. And I'm not going to try and go through each individual timeline and how they fit. There's a vertical red line just to the right of center, which is where we are today. And you'll see that the top couple of rows are the ICH work. The next one down is the individual elements that are going through for combination between what CDISC and ICH are doing. There's then a blue row. That's some of the work that FDA are doing with their PRISM initiative. We're then down into some of the other work that the M2 part of ICH are doing. Then we get down to the individual CDISC releases, which are in the sort of bluey green color. And then we get down into Vulcan and the Vulcan specific things done in yellow. So there's a lot of different moving parts in this, a lot of different timelines. And that's what we are trying to pull all these pieces together in a way that people will understand. And you'll see in the boxes, really along the bottom rows of this, frequent occurrence of a webinar and a connectathon. So we're in the third of the webinars at the moment. We've just done the second one of our Connectathons, and that's the communication process that we have for keeping people up to speed with where we're going, what we're doing, and how all of this is developing. Because if you took a more traditional view of how this approaches, you would get all the development work happening until you got really to the right-hand edge of this drawing. And that time point then would be well into next year, possibly into 2026, at which point a standard will be produced. And everybody would then be expected to pick up that standard and work with it. But of course, that's really quite difficult and time consuming and expensive because people don't know what the standard is. They don't know how to make use of it. What we are trying to do now is to make that standard visible much earlier in the process, to think about different ways in which it might be used that go beyond that original ICH use case. And those are what get tested out in the Connectathon part. I'm going to talk some more about Connectathons in a minute when Dave and I do the shared session. But for now, I will leave it at that point. Chris, anything I missed that you want to add back in?
No, I think you covered it. I think that the container is exactly how we've talked about it before, and I think that covers and addresses sort of the differences, right? And I think it's been one of the, in my experience with collaborations, one of the best collaborations we've had in terms of everybody understanding their role, right? You think about a team, and I think it's worked very well. So I'm excited to get on to hear about you and Dave and the Connectathon.
Okay. So shall we move on to the next section then? Okay, so Dave and I are going to talk about the actual Connectathon itself. And as I said a minute ago, I'll just tell you a little bit about what a Connectathon is, first of all. So the idea behind the Connectathon is that the best way of working out whether something works or not is to sit people together around a table and get them to try it out. So you provide them with some sample data, you provide them with the standard, you give them some sort of an implementation guidance, you provide them with some test systems, and you see if it works. And the one thing that we all know is that when you do that process, the first thing you discover is that it doesn't work. And it doesn't work usually for very minor, very trivial reasons. Somebody's not connected A to B in a way that appeared to be obvious to somebody. Because you've got everybody sitting around a table, resolving those sorts of differences becomes very easy because you simply look across the table to the person who wrote the other piece of the system you're trying to work with and say, why doesn't this do what I expect it to do? And you both look at the same thing, you realize what needs fixing, and you fix it there and then. So it's a very efficient way of getting rid of all the silly things that stop systems working. And if you also bring along a set of people who are experts in the business process that you're working with, they can actually look at what you're doing and say, that's all very well, but we don't quite work like that. This is the way we do things. So you can modify the way you're actually representing things to get a better workflow overall. Connectathons are something that came into existence in HL7 with Fire, and I think have probably been the single thing which has contributed to the success of Fire across so many different applications in so many different systems, really right the way around the world. A typical Connectathon has between 300 and 500 people on something like 35 to 40 different tracks. So while this picture shows you something that looks quite quiet and peaceful, If you saw the picture that was facing in the opposite direction, you'd actually see a very large room with an awful lot of people, all busy working away, and more laptops than you think you could get into a single room. So next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through this in fine detail, but when you run a Connectathon, the objective is to have a scenario, a description of a part of your business process, and that is what you are trying to replicate. So we have taken for both our Connectathons so far a very broad view of things. So how do we create a protocol? How do we send that protocol to another system? How do we receive it? And we assume that the sender for the use case that we are initially dealing with is a sponsor, and we assume that the receiver is a regulator. So once you've got it there, how do we then get the sponsor sending some comment back, or the regulator sending comment back to regulator? How do we get that feedback loop? And it's this basic business process of getting your protocol to the regulator and getting something up and functioning that we are trying to deal with. And we started with a very high level view of things, looking at it almost as if we were dealing with a standard document being transferred at an electronic form of document transfer. And then as we have come into the next iteration of the Connectathons, we started to drill into that process in more detail and start to take more individual data elements from USDM to be able to represent those and deal with those as single items. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Dave, who'll talk more about the specific processes we had in the most recent Connectathon and how some of that process worked through. So, Dave, over to you.
Thank you. If we get to the next slide, please. I like to draw a slide. We've done 2 Connectathons, and Atlanta, September was the second of those, obviously. The first one was very much loading from Excel. So we had a lot of structured data on the document, the protocol. We could transmit it to a couple of receivers. We could receive back. We wanted on the second Connectathon to take quite a leap. And as you can see, top left, ICH M11 protocols. Rob Ferrando had kindly translated some old protocols into the M11 template format. And on the first Connectathon, we'd done a lot of work sort of cutting and pasting to build messages and this sort of thing. I wanted to make it easy, so we built an application which would actually read the docx directly and bring that document into USDM, so into the model. Then that's one click. Second click, we could then transmit as a message, the file message, the updated profile, and it would go off, put it onto a server, and then another program could put it down and display rebuild the protocol into a human readable form. What I really emphasize, Hugh was talking about the architecture and the 3 layers, and I really want to emphasize, you'll see at the bottom of the slide, the 3 blocks, the red fire M11 message profile at the bottom, which is very much the sort of communication. Above that, unified study definitions model, providing the system sort of database layer, the persistence layer for storing of the information. And then at the top, the human readable layer, the M11 template. We want dashboards, we want, whatever the human needs to consume. So I want to really emphasize that as Chris and Hugh were talking before, this is about ensuring that the three standards work hand in glove, in unison, fit nicely, so that if you use USDM or you're using M11, you've got the appropriate standards which you know will work and do the appropriate job for you. So very much sponsor to regulator, read the document in, we can display it at the other end, and then we can, basically do the opposite direction. First Connectathon was very much about just taking the sections of text from a document and putting them into a composition. What we wanted to do in the second one was now start structuring. If you look at M11, there's a first section which gives a sort of an overview, a summary of the protocol. It gives you the phase, it gives you the titles, this sort of thing, the compounds. I tend to refer it as title page. So we wanted to structure that because it's got a lot of useful information that you would, if you had 20, 30, 40 protocols in your system, you'd want to search on, search by title, search by phase, this sort of thing, therapeutic area type things. Inclusion, exclusion, as Hugh's mentioned, we wanted to structure those. Estimates, objectives, and endpoints was another area of interest. And then if we got that far, we wanted to start touching on the amendments part of protocols, because obviously there's version control and all that sort of good stuff. That's written, that little list there, structured parts of the M11 template, is sort of written in our priority order. And we did title page, inclusion, exclusion, and we got into estimates, objectives, and endpoints to a reasonable amount. But we managed to essentially take a Word document through USDM, fire message to the other end, and redisplayed out again. So from that perspective, very much a success. Just a little before we move on to the next slide, from personal thanks to Rick Smithies and Brian Alper for helping me with all the fire stuff. I used to go to HL7 meetings a long time ago, before the days of fire, back in the days of version 3. I did the last Connectathon, I did this Connectathon and into the working group meeting, sort of reliving some old experiences and meeting a few old friends. But Rick and Brian really helped with the sort of HL7 fire stuff, which is a little bit new, but we were successful. And as Hugh was saying, you're sitting around a table, Rick's on the opposite side, Brian's there. Why isn't this working, Rick? And you sort it out. You fix this, you fix that. And we had 2 very, very good days, technical work, but also some very good discussions, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that's the scenario. Document, read it in, USDM to fire, and then the receiving end can choose to do what it wants, but hopefully USDM, M11 protocols, displaying dashboards, what have you. So next slide, please. This is a build, so hopefully this might, just because we're asking for the slides to be advanced, it'd be a little slower than normal. But this is just a sequence of what we did. So we, classic web app, choose a file. If you hit the next slide, please, you then go and select your M11 document. And as Hugh said, the nice thing about the M11 is we now know where things should be. We know that there's going to be a title page. Some of the fields are optional, but we know what we're expecting on the title page. We know where the inclusion, exclusion are. As I say, we had 5 example documents. We did tweak a couple of them to improve. Mary Lynn and Rob added to the estimate sections such that we had some more realistic data, which was very much appreciated. So if we advance one more slide, it loads, and it loads quite quickly. It's 10 seconds, 20 seconds, depending on, if you're running on a laptop or you're running on a remote server. Doesn't take that long to bring in the whole M11 document. And to the next slide, please, or the next build, and you get a protocol. And what we've managed to do, this is USDM working here. We've managed to put the various pieces from the document into the right places, so we can pick out the title, we can pick out the name of the sponsor, we can pick out, in this case, University of Philly, we can pick out the identifier, phase, etc., etc. And we're marking it as an M11 document because we can load from various other sources an Excel representation, this type of thing. Okay, so that's what we did. I think hit the next slide, please, which takes us. We then transmit it. So one click, please load that file, and then we choose to transmit it to a given endpoint. And this is just a little bit of JSON from that same protocol. You can see the same title and all the rest of it going out. Do notice the example.org, and this is one area we need to sort of work on now. We need to fill out the details, and Rick and myself, we use some sort of temporary codes so that we could identify the various structured pieces. Those now need to be filled in with the appropriate, formal terminology that we need from the fire side. We will also need to bring in, and we'll talk about this later as well, the M11 terminology, which is being managed by CDISC and shared by USDM. So the USDM M11 terminology is very consistent already. Next slide. And what we can do is we can also display that same document in the M11 template, M11 format, because it's an M11 document, funnily enough. And this is what you see, and you can see the first part of the title page, full titles, protocol identifier, original protocol, version date, and it goes on down the road. And if you just hit the next build, I think, yeah, we can go to various sections and all the rest of it. You can just jump to a section, all the rest of it, and look through the whole document as a protocol. If we hit the next slide. But the nice thing is, as Hugh said, we now know where things are. We know where stuff is. There's a section in the beginning of the M11 document, and you see it on the overall design bit there. Key aspects of the trial design are summarized below. The summary, we've got the overall trial schema, objectives, endpoints, estimates. We can pick these things out because we know where they are and display them in whatever ways the user wishes. And this was from a wireframe that Ron Fitzmartin from the FDA produced and showed in the last webinar. We've now made it real. It's live. It works with M11 documents, so we can do that sort of thing. So it's nice. It's giving us a lot of power to do dashboards and processing, and people can see what the information they need. You can put two protocols side by side, for instance, and view the equivalent sections. Next section. You saw some pictures. That was taken on the second day. That one picture that Hugh had on his slide earlier, that was taken on day 2. This was day 1. And look at the picture on the right. That's what a Connectathon looks like. Normally, the American football bars aren't there. We were next door to the main hotel in a very nice room, a little bit more fancy than the normal Connectathon rooms I've worked in, but it was a very nice, and you can see, as Hugh said, sort of 30-40 tables, 6-8 people around each table working technically together, solving problems. Why doesn't it work? Are you receiving it? Why doesn't that bit display properly? And you work it out. But it was a success. I say 5 protocols. We processed them nicely into USDM and then into Fire. There is the proviso about the CT, but we will be bringing that into the spec over the coming months to sort of formalize that as M11 goes through its review process and becomes, a much more solid specification. Hugh, I don't know whether you want to add anything now and take over.
Okay, well, let's go on to the next slide, I think, please. So that's really a very successful Connectathon that Dave's just described. I think the key thing for me is having that application actually running and being able to look at it. But where do we go next? This is the sequence as I showed you on the timeline earlier. So as we go forward into January, which will be the next Connectathon, things that we want to be able to do within that. We want to add more structured elements. That's always going to be the case with every Connectathon. Each one will get more and more and more structured pieces that you can do things like the dashboard that Dave was just showing. One part of that we will go to next will probably be the schedule activities work. I said earlier that there was some of that had already been done within Vulcan. It will be good to actually bring that in and integrate that with the work that's been done before. We also want to get more people to come and contribute to that. So it's one thing having a technical team working at things, and very much what we need to do in the early phases of this. But the more we go on, the more we really want to have the actual stakeholders who are going to be building tools for doing these things. The stakeholders are actually going to be using them to come along and participate in this and point out what works, what doesn't work, what they can already fit into what they're doing, what they need to do as new items. We also want to make sure that we are integrated with the other implementation guides in FIRE that are also hitting clinical research at the same time. So we've got things like the electronic product information, the EPI work. We've got the pharmaceutical quality stuff, the PQCMC. They're all running on very much the same pattern. Effectively, they all use the same shipping containers. And we want to make sure that we're not missing anything in the way that we work that through. So next slide, please. This last one is just a summary of comments really from people who attended this. I'm not going to read all of them through, but they illustrate just the importance of bringing people together to actually work on things like this. It gives you a degree of understanding that you do not get if you simply sit and look at something either by yourself or in a demonstration from somebody. If you're sitting there working at it and you're actually seeing it as a problem-solving session rather than a demonstration, you get a level of involvement and understanding that you wouldn't have otherwise. And that sort of package that Dave was demonstrating is really key to that. The jargon term is a reference application, but those are the things that we actually need to really help people understand what's going on. And I think Dave's done a great job of starting that off. So with that, I think we are ready.
Can I just
yes,
add something before you just leave this slide? We've got a few, I know we're slightly ahead of schedule, so I'll fill the time. We had some really good discussions in Atlanta. And it wasn't so much technical discussions, obviously Rick and myself and Brian and the other technical folks were doing that, but we had some really good discussions about, oh, I can see it on the screen, and can we do this? Can we do that? It makes it real. And we had some, and it's also very useful for people like myself because we hear the viewpoint of the actual users and the challenges they face in their day-to-day work. So it was a very good sort of two-way street on, oh, can you do that technically? I didn't realize you could do that technically. Oh, I didn't realize you did that in your day job. You know, it was very much a two-way street. And I do say this in jest, we will be limiting certain participants to only 10 questions a day in the future. Because at one point I was thinking, I really need to get on with my technical work because we were having such good discussions. But it was very good. And I would encourage people who aren't the technical folks to actually come and see this stuff because it will make you think. It will make you go, I could do this, I could do, why can't we do that? And then somebody can go, yeah, we have difficulty doing that because of, you know, X, Y, Z, whatever it may be. Anyway, just wanted to add that. Sorry, Hugh.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so with that, let's hand over to Vivian, I think.
Yeah, I just did pop back on camera. I wanted to echo what Dave just said around having different voices around the table. When you try to describe a Connectathon to someone who hasn't been to one, it is a technical event. So you think about connecting the data from one flow to another. but the people connections and the process connections and the enlightenment that we were able to have was extremely valuable. So when we look forward to future Connectathons, many of them will be as described, a 2-day in-person event, and it is an absolute opportunity for non-technical people to engage. We may give you jobs if you show up. We may ask you to change something in a protocol or to run a test, but it's great conversation. We're also looking at holding virtual Connectathons, which is a bit of a different setting and may have some more educational components versus you're sitting around a table and having some ad hoc conversation. But lots of great ways to get involved in the future, and I do think it helps one side see the other, and where in our life can't we use more of that. So with that, I'll pass it over to Vivian to take us through the view towards implementation.
Okay, so hopefully you're all now asking yourselves, how do I get going? We've maybe whetted your appetite with the possibilities now that they are real. It's very, very exciting to see some of these things that we've known about conceptually for many years and dreamed of, and now they're really starting to come to life. And it's for those of us who've been close to it, it's almost breathtaking to see it really in action concretely here. It's a really long gestation period that we've been through. So how do we get to implementation? So that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about. There's continuing this idea of being hungry to get going. There's quite a menu to choose from in terms of how do you get started. It's a big, big space with lots and lots of use cases, near term, further term. So how do you get started? Even people close to it, it's very easy to get overwhelmed with just there's so much here. So I think what those who have spent a lot of time really thinking about this and who are tasked with driving it within their own organizations, the wisdom has sort of crystallized that it's good to pick something, pick one problem. Or one place where you want to really leverage the digital protocol for the first time. So just solve one problem. There's many things that it's going to end up helping to solve. But to get started, focus on one. It'll help you focus. It'll help focus your stakeholders. It'll keep everybody else from getting overwhelmed as well. So there's quite a menu, though, to choose from. So starting in the upper left, I'm not going to read all of these, but a perennial favorite is, can I get an automated, generation of my CRF from this digital protocol? How about moving my protocol content to downstream documents? Those are a couple of real sort of some of the most obvious use cases. I think of it almost as comfort food. They're the ones that we really can see and understand, but there's some more sophisticated use cases here too, like using that digital protocol to do analytics to maybe optimize your design, transforming how you do your work. Really, instead of starting with, all processes start with a protocol in many places. Maybe you can start thinking about starting your processes from that digital design or those digital elements, and rethinking how your processes work. So there's almost no end to the number of places in our work that a digital protocol is going to transform. So the first thing to do now that it's here on our doorstep is really think about, for your organization, where you're situated, what makes sense as the first thing you want to tackle with it. And so if we could go to the next slide, I'm going to elaborate on this just a little bit. So these are not real companies that I'm referring to. These are sort of imaginary composite companies, but these are pretty realistic. So let's say, for example, there's a big pharma company. They are very complex. The work is often done in kind of functional silos, and maybe even divided up into different therapeutic areas who potentially even operate as different business units. And there are groups that, there are groups that are used to working together and groups that are not used to working together. And those are pretty entrenched because the way we do clinical trials has been largely the same for 30-ish years. And that's not just based on how long I've been in pharma, but that's kind of when ICH came along and the modern way of doing trials really was established. And so for big pharma that's been around that long, these things are very, very entrenched, and the relationships are strong where they're strong, and they may not be existent really between certain functional groups. Processes can be hard to wrangle and hard to change. We have lots of technology and existing systems that have to work together. So the culture tends to be like we're looking for efficiency, but there's a lot to overcome to really do something that's this transformational. And then I'm going to contrast that with a different kind of situation that you may find yourself in, which is maybe you're in a smaller startup or a biotech. Those organizations tend to be more flat. The teams are really just focused on getting their molecule to the next milestone. The roles are fluid. People wear a lot of different hats. You may not be exclusively focused on one kind of role. You may flex around quite a bit to get things done. Processes probably not nearly as rigid or as well established as they would be in a long-term kind of big pharma, which gives you some agility. It also gives you some things to figure out, but there's some agility that comes with that. You may not have a big technology kind of footprint that you have to manage. You may be dealing with small systems that aren't particularly well integrated. And again, that gives you some more options and some more flexibility to work with. And typically those kinds of companies are really open to innovation, like just show me what I need to get my product delivered. So really different contexts you may find yourself in, which makes the implementation very different. There's lots of different considerations here for how you might come into this digital protocol kind of reality. So let's dig in a little bit on each of those. If we want to go to the next slide, we're going to take a look at this big pharma kind of an example first. And so I mentioned there's a lot of established process, maybe lots of, it's generally just large. The largeness can be a challenge. Operating across different governance structures, different business units can sometimes be part of that context. And so one of the first things that somebody in that particular situation may need to do is get a grip on what is. How many templates do you actually have? Are you on to one common harmonized template? Not even talking about a preferred one, but just are you on one template, or do you have 5 or 10 or 15 even within your organization operating now? And is it clear who's governing that? Who is the decider for making potential changes? So there's a bit about, and that's just thinking in the paper kind of context. If you've got systems behind all that, then the complexity starts to even multiply there. So in that situation, one of the things is just to really assess your current state. And are you even in a position with the way things are governed and owned to start moving down this really innovative path? If not, maybe you want to start with some of that and get some work done there before you start even looking at technology, or kind of while you're looking at technology as well. You're going to have to think about where the technology needs to have plugins and interfaces, how the data is going to flow from systems that are upstream and then further downstream. And then you'll be ready to talk to leaders and stakeholders about what the value may be. And again, to try and calculate the value across all of those different use cases and more that I showed on the first page, it's almost incomprehensible. So I wouldn't advise you to try to do that. Maybe try and put a value on your one use case and champion that. Trust me, this will be the gift that keeps on giving. There will be more value to be had, and even one use case can be quite compelling here. So maybe focus on the one. And cast a vision. There's the vision around your use case, which can be big, and then there's the big vision around, moving into this space in a really holistic way. So depending on your stakeholder group, you may just want to focus on the vision for your one use case. There's a few stakeholders you'll need to bring along on the big vision, but not everybody's ready for that, and it can get a little technical kind of fast. So think through who your stakeholders are and, how you want to paint that picture of the future. But you're going to need to talk about your vision on a couple of different levels for different audiences. And then think through a transition roadmap. Think about what's got to change from a culture perspective, what's the change management that you need to install. How do you, again, plug those systems? How do you deploy systems and make sure they stay on during the transition, all the critical ones? There's a lot to think through in terms of transition. And I will say transition is quite different than just standing up a system that has never been. It's different to replace an authoring tool than to just stand one up for the first time, that's a little bit more fancy than Microsoft Word. So again, transition roadmap, really important. And then you get to execution. So that's kind of what a big pharma example might look like. Again, every situation is going to be a little bit unique, but there are some common themes around big pharma. And then if we go to the next example, let's look at maybe in a smaller biotech, more nimble, more flexible, like we talked about. You probably can just skip past some of the wrangling of what is, because there's not a whole lot of that. Or it may be more abbreviated than it would be in big pharma. And you can probably get to, again, picking that use case. What is the problem or set of problems that you want to solve with deploying a technology? You may come into it really starting with the technology piece. What am I going to adopt, and what am I adopting it to do? There's some good resources here. DDF, the Transcelerate DDF team has a personas toolkit. You can also then start looking at your technology landscape. What's out there? There's getting to be really some interesting things out there. So do that landscape assessment. There's some tools to help you. Again, true it up with the problem that you're trying to solve. And then think about your implementation roadmap. There may not be as much in terms of transition, and it's more just standing it up, establishing true process for the first time, establishing some governance maybe for the first time, and then getting going on the journey and measuring success. So maybe a different spin depending on how you're situated. Next slide. There are some folks who are down a path here, like nobody's realized this future yet. We're all at our own points in the journey, but some are further along than others. So here's some lessons learned that the Transcelerate community has to offer up to this conversation. One, you don't have to do this alone. Even if you're not a direct member of Transcelerate, there's a lot of resources out there. There's public webinars. They talked about some of those opportunities to get connected with this community. So don't be shy. There's people and resources to help you. getting some leader support up front is really, really important. This is not, I don't think, something you can do in a grassrootsy kind of way. You won't get too far. You really are going to need some leader support and sponsorship. Think through how you're going to implement. So we talked about picking a use case. Also think about how do you want to do, maybe your organization really likes to do pilots and then can scale quickly after successful pilots. Maybe it's more of an agile rollout where you kind of learn and grow as you go. Think through what works for you, but really have an approach in mind. And then break it down. Like, not only should you, I think, maybe pick a use case, but then even break that down into bite-sized pieces so that people recognize it is a big journey, but there's successes to be had along the way. And really kind of with that are how you're going to measure that success, because as I said, there's so much value here. You're going to have plenty to cheer about as you go. And then the big picture, as you start moving into reality, becomes more and more compelling. But there's going to be plenty to celebrate along the way. And so as you're thinking about your roadmap, you may want to be very deliberate about how you sequence those in so that folks keep the faith and can see their progress. And then I would say think through how your process is going to complement the new technology. You may need to do some process work here. Almost certainly you'll need to do some process work. And you got to strike the balance between, you want to make use of the technology, but also, if you don't want to throw technology at a process that's like not optimal. So think through, what's your optimal process going to be that's going to complement the technology really well. If you can do that prospectively, that is going to set you up for a more pleasant journey. And then I think this might be the last slide. Can somebody just double check? Oh, no, it's not. There's one more. Sorry. What can you do now? So if you want to just go ahead and build out the slide, that'd be great. If you don't have a good grip and handle on your templates yet, that's a great place to start, even if you're just still in the paper world. So think about if you haven't adopted the Common Protocol template or the early version of M11, being on the Common Protocol template will put you in a great position to ultimately transition and adopt the ICH M11 template. The M11 template, there was a draft that was put out publicly, I think it's been over a year ago. It's been kind of a long year. But anyway, it really followed CPT. You could see the influence of CPT on that M11 draft. It has since changed a bit, and it will go out, the M11 will go out for public comment again in the spring. At that point, I don't look for it to change a whole lot. It could still change, but probably not major changes after the public comment cycle that's going to happen in the spring. But even then, if you're not familiar with the ICH process, so it has to go out for public comment, and then all the regulators have to decide that, we're done with it, this is the final thing. And then each regulator sets an implementation timeline in their region. So there's still some runway on M11. So if you haven't got to CPT yet, that's a great place to start. If you're already sitting with CPT implemented in your organization, you're going to be in a great place for a transition to M11 whenever you choose to do that. There will be a transition, but it will be much more orderly than if you're not similarly situated. So maybe start with CPT. Think about when you're going to move to M11 from a paper perspective, and then when do you want to go to the digital piece of it? Maybe you're going to do paper and digital at the same time. But you can also do those in phases. But there's sort of then, okay, how do I get used to writing a protocol where I have a constrained list of choices for how I describe something, and get used to, headers being a data element and paragraphs behaving like a field. So making that digital transition is the next step. Then thinking about how you're going to apply and curate the broader USDM, not just the M11 subset of USDM, but the whole USDM. There's a lot of power in those pieces that go beyond M11. And then, the really super fancy state is when we're all sending this around using Fire, which is still a bit in the future, but not so far away. Like, we're starting to really see it. So start really thinking holistically about how you're going to progress through some of these changes. I think that's where I'm going to stop and entertain any questions. Can somebody just confirm there's not one more slide? Yeah, okay, that's the end. That's what I thought. All right, thanks, Stacy, or whoever's advancing the slides. I think now we're going to have a panel.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Vivian, for that great look at implementation. So I invite all the speakers to come back on. You can continue to put questions in the questions panel. We have a number of great questions here and those that were submitted during the registration process. We will get to as many as we possibly can. And to do that, I'm going to probably merge some questions. There are some common themes. So I'm going to start with some basics. Just let's refresh on what's available today. There was a couple of questions around this, including the outputs of the Connectathon. So I think Vivian addressed from a ICH perspective what's available and when the next set is coming, the next public release that was coming in the spring. We heard that, not public release, public comment. Is that right, Vivian? The next public comment for M11. Okay, so then I will turn to Chris or Dave, whoever would like to give us an update on what's available today from a USDM perspective. And then Hugh, if you can speak to timing of what would be coming available out of the UDP project directly. Chris?
Sure, thanks, Stacey. I'll ask Dave to maybe give a little bit more context or detail, but I think as we look at USDM, we released version 3 of USDM earlier this spring, and it has a lot of the information, the harmonization with M11 at this point in time, as well as a lot more detail about schedule of activities and control terminology. So that is a fairly foundational model. We are working on version 4 of USDM, which is due out in the spring, and there's really a focus there on making sure we look at a stronger API, more content. We close the gaps that we're finding as we go through these exercises, as well as continuing to harmonize with M11. So as M11 moves, it's not final, it's coming out for public comment, we need to continue to harmonize with it. So that'll be an ongoing process. But Dave, you can give a little bit more detail about things that are maybe coming.
Yeah, as Chris said, version 3 came out, so Q2 this year. We're looking for sort of Q1, Q2 for the next release. We want to make sure that obviously we're aligned nicely with M11, that's terminology and all that sort of thing. We've made sure that we're trying to cover off a few bases like IDM, make sure we're sort of more closely aligned with IDMP, where we use sort of common information, that sort of thing, so that we're borrowing from other standards. I will say one thing. People ask us, when will it be stable, and this sort of thing, and backward compatibility and these sorts of things. It's a little bit tricky. We need experience of using it, which is why Hugh and as Hugh said, the Connectathons are brilliant because we're actually using USDM in anger. But we do need the experience of people using it. We do need that feedback. We do appreciate that every time we change it, we move it forward, then obviously there's a little bit of implementation work, that sort of thing. But we need to bring M11, USDM together and get it solid, and we do need to improve it. So I think version 4 will be a very solid foundation, and then we'll have to think hard about how we tweak it, maintain it going forward, so that we strike that balance between improving it versus not having too much impact, for vendors and system providers. So it is, but it's a tricky one to get the right balance. Don't know whether you want to add to that, Chris, on that last point.
And then if Chris isn't jumping in, I'm going to turn to Hugh to give a bit of a what's available coming out of UDP. Is there code available from the Connectathon?
Okay, thanks. So the Connectathon results are summarized and are available if you follow links through to the Connectathon. There's links toward the end of the slide deck you can follow. And Connectathons themselves are open events, so anybody who wants to join in is very welcome to come and join. And as I say, the conclusions that we come to and what we've done follow on from that. We want to make the tooling that we're working with as available as possible to people. So there will be opportunity to get access to things and make use of those. We're also on the point of starting the actual implementation guide. And the implementation guide is not something that's going to be ready and finished instantly. It will go through a whole series of iterations. One of the things about fire is keeping consistency between versions. So I know people that have a real sense that, oh, I don't want to do anything until it's got to the final version because I'll only have to make changes. Well, actually, the number of changes that are breaking changes that mean you have to go back and redo something is always pretty minimal in fire. I'm not saying that they don't happen sometimes, but they're not a frequent occurrence. So I would encourage everybody, when we start to publicize the new implementation guide, which should be later on this autumn, that you start to come out, you start to look at it, you start to think about how you might be able to make use of that and do things with it. So I'll hand it back to you, Stacey.
Yeah, thank you, Hugh. Again, combining a couple of questions, but there were some notes around how integrated are these different pieces, these projects. And I hope we've answered a lot of that today. It does make me think about that timeline slide and how all of these things are being developed, not in sequence, but in parallel. So maybe I would ask around, I think we've addressed today how the content, how the actual deliverables are being integrated. I'm interested in questions that were relevant to how are the organizations integrating the projects, the visions, the strategies. So maybe Hugh, I would start with you, and then open to Chris or Vivian or others on how are you aligning sort of the big picture vision in addition to the tactical deliverables?
The Connectathons and the implementation guide I just mentioned are really key to the way we operate. So we're not working on the basis of some enormous grand vision and, eventually it will all be done. We're working at a more tactical level. Indeed, as Vivian said, take bite-sized pieces and work on those bite-sized pieces. So from Vulcan's perspective, our objective is to keep organizing the Connectathons, to document what's going on in the Connectathons and how the implementation guide reflects what we've learned to that point, and keep publishing that. And each Connectathon will have a new take on an existing business process, or it will have a new business process as part of it. So that over time, we work towards the entirety of all the business processes we might look at. Please don't wait until we've got to the end of that process. Now is a good time to start. Work with bite-sized processes. That's what we're trying to deliver. So, Dave, Chris?
Yeah, I can say from a CDISC perspective, we're at our interchange, which is next week. We're going to be launching and talking about our 360i initiative, which is a transformation of our standards to go from end to end, right? And a big component of that end to end is digital protocols. So from a broader viewpoint, one of our targets as we look at our 360i initiative next year is to target that design piece, that digital protocol, and linking to the downstream components, right? How do we take that and then link it in an automated way to collection and STTM generation? So I can tell you we're taking that piece as we look at our initiative and integrating it into so if you think about broader, still bite-sized pieces, but that's the piece that we're taking within CDISC and linking it up. How do we take design and let design drive the generation of our standards downstream?
That's great. Vivian, I'm going to ask you a question on this theme of integrating pieces. It was mentioned around the common protocol template and the M11 interim versions that have been available, or they don't align today. Do you have thoughts about, first of all, if folks are looking to act now, what they use, what they should update their templates to, and then will these items be integrated?
Yeah. So I'm gonna answer that question, Stacy. But first, I'm gonna answer the other question you asked a minute ago, which is, are we all? Is it an accident that we're all like working on the same stuff at the same time? It is not an accident. There are strategic, formalized partnerships that are happening between ICH and CDISC and Vulcan to make sure that this does all align. Now, and the M11 piece of it. I think, we'll look back on this someday and like M11 was like maybe a small piece, but it's the key piece that brings the structure and the, some really some of the mastered metadata that is needed. So it's kind of, you need the M11 piece to make everything else make sense and to give you that framework. And then CDISC and Vulcan, they're adding tons more value by building out some of the things that M11 doesn't get down to that level of detail. So this is all happening in a very intentional way to make sure we stay coordinated and we're pushing toward that same general idea. And then in terms of how do we, so some things are a little out of sync right now. That happens when you got different groups moving at different paces. And this one needs something from that group before they can do their next thing. So there's a lot of that going on. So they are out of the CPT and M11 are a little out of sync right now. I think that's true. The M11 protocol template, you'll see its next iteration in the spring. Then it has to be officially adopted. It likely won't change a ton after the version that we see in the spring. That'll be the public comment on the technical specification. So a lot of the details that we didn't have yet when we did the first public comment cycle will be available in the technical spec coming in the spring. I believe that Transcelerate's intention is to update the CPT to align with the next iteration of M11. I don't know what the timeline is on that, and Transcelerate obviously is not obligated to do that. But I believe that is the plan right now. And so, what's a company to do if you're kind of sitting there wondering, I'm just here to say it's still a great choice to start by adopting CPT. You'll be in the best position to move to what's next whenever what's next is fully mature. And so that's a great place to be. You could make a different choice. You could choose to go after all of it at the same time. Having lived through that is quite a lot, and that's a big undertaking. So depending on how you want to do it, but it's never a bad move to adopt the CPT. That'll put you in a good place to then evaluate what your next move is and when you want to make it.
Great, thank you. We are going to save 2 minutes at the end so I can give folks the resources and address who can attend a Connectathon. So I'm going to give you all one more question. It's the same question. There was a number of questions around regulators, the direction of regulators, and what are they intending here. There was mention of the PRISM project. It was another one of the swim lanes. We don't have a representative from a regulator here today to talk about their intent or the PRISM project, but I would encourage everyone to listen to the last webinar, and I can assure you from PRISM, for those who are familiar with it, this whole group here is working with that team as well to ensure we are aligning, advancing the digitized protocol on UDP with the work that's being done in PRISM. But my question that I am going to put to you is, what is in the future, whether it's from a regulator perspective or an AI perspective or a registry perspective, what is the one thing you're most excited that this harmonized protocol work that we're doing today will enable? So what's coming ahead? Anybody want to volunteer to go first?
I'll make the answer quick on my front. In all my years, 30 plus of working with regulatory and industry, the relative speed I've seen of the engagement with this, especially over the last 12 to 18 months with M11, and then the willingness for M11 to collaborate very, very openly with CDISC and Vulcan and others, is the likes of which I have not seen in my 30 years. Even though M11 has been around since 2018, that collaboration, again, over the last 12 to 18 months, there's excitement both within ICH M11 as well as within like PRISM, which is an FDA specific project, to look at these things and to look at it in a different way. And so that's just a high level statement, as I've been very impressed by that engagement.
Just to from my perspective, it gives us a solid foundation to do so much. We saw Vivian's use cases. It enables so much. It's the piece we've been missing for so many years from an electronic perspective. It opens up a whole world of possibilities.
Yeah, I think that's my answer is very similar. When I look at how many of our processes of developing drugs are really underpinned by the protocol, changing its format and digitizing it enables so much transformation that, I mean, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that it will, really transform the way we do a lot of our operational processes and help us get our programs done faster and get medicine to patients faster and more efficiently. Like that, I don't think that's an overstatement, and it's the thing that makes my socks roll up and down and come to work every day.
So my offering is the extent to which we will be able to connect the whole process of studies into that wider care process, whether that's somebody sitting in a hospital bed where you can tie the schedule of activities into the rest of their care plan in a way that everybody's clear about and everybody understands the timing, or whether you're going to take something out into community-based trials where, because you can do stuff in a digital fashion, it becomes feasible to hand stuff over to novel suppliers of trial execution, but confident that you're not going through this enormous effort of transcription and all the errors that come to it. We've actually got something which is a robust way of communicating both to the performers and getting the results back. I think that will have an enormous impact in the long run.
I love how you all hit on different stakeholders and different processes. It really shows the connectivity and impact of this project. So thank you, panelists, all fantastic information. If you want to go to the next slide, we have a few wrap-up thoughts to leave with you. An update that we will have a Connectathon in January, likely a virtual one, to allow broad participation. There were 2 questions around participating in Connectathon. You do not have to be a technical expert. Anyone can register. happy to share links in this deck and in the handout, but it's just an event you register for on the HL7 website. All are welcome. We will be doing more of these webinars, generally one after each Connectathon, so look for more of those to come. The next slide is just a bit of a resource piece for you. Here's the links. These are all in the handouts as well. We look forward to more participation in the Connectathons, particularly if we start focusing on schedule of activities and starts to get to those value drivers that particularly Vivian and Hugh just spoke of. Webinars will be available to all. The recordings are posted, and welcome to share those with colleagues. We are also looking to initiate some communities of interest to allow a more open forum for more dialogue. We recognize this is a bit didactic, and we got to only a small percentage of the questions today. So we do want to keep hearing what you have to say and keep providing some more information and in some additional ways in the future. And so with that, we are right at the end of our time. I want to thank all of you who hung on today and joined, and thank you again to our wonderful panelists. Have a great day, everyone.